welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalygin, and this episode we're coming at you in the midst of what appears to be one of the largest escalations in the ongoing Third World War since we started this show. The United States has conducted dozens, if not, almost 100 strikes at this point across Yemen on Houthi targets. Of course, this is a rapid escalation and is separate from the Operation Prosperity Guardian naval operation that we've discussed in the past. Of course, there's things going on in Chabad Lubavitch headquarters, 770 in Brooklyn. Of course, that happened right after we stopped recording last show, so you're going to get our take on the tunnels, things going on in Ukraine and Russia, of course, things going on in Germany as the right rises across the European Union, civil war in Ecuador, U.S.-Mexico border is leading to intense clashes between Texas State Police and Federal Border Patrol, so things going on across the map. Dimitri, it looks a little grim, but it's also very exciting. How are you doing?
Doing good, and I just wanted to say we are amidst the mitzvah, and in fact, we are seeing the Red Sea, of course, is properly now engulfed in flames. Again, the red hot war between the US and the Navy of the UK, and I would say just the entire NATO Navy and the Houthis has properly begun. More than 100 missiles were fired in the last few days. This is the middle of January 2024, and confirmed targets all over the Houthi-held Yemenis end of the Arabian Peninsula has been reported. Although, as always in similar strikes in Afghanistan and other places in the Middle East, you begin to question really quickly just how much damage was wrought by these expensive $1 million missiles of the US, the UK, shot from their ships, shot from their F-22 planes. Would the missile even be worth more than the target that it actually struck? And in fact, of course, the Americans and the British are reporting almost no losses, right? There's apparently 2 sailors drowned off the coast of Africa somewhere in a completely unrelated case, American sailors. So, but we'll keep an eye out on that story in particular. Maybe it'll be one of those scenarios where actually 2 men did die to something Houthi related, and in fact they were reported as drowned, and only later will their families actually find out. But that's a little bit conspiratorial. But let's get back to the actual facts reported by all these famous and wonderful news outlets. And we are seeing that, no, look, the official reports are no American planes were hit in this particular strike. No American ships were hit, although there is footage naturally circulating everywhere that, there's a ship with some smoke coming out of it, things like that. And the Houthis themselves are not really making too many outrageous claims either. So, but we are seeing that the Houthis will be retaliating in the next few days, right? Retaliating for the American strikes on them and on their territory, because again, this is very similar to, it's more targeted and probably a bit more precise than what Israel is doing to Hamas and Gaza. So let's just keep that in mind. It's not like Obama era droning of children, things like that. But I'm still assuming there were probably innocent Yemenis people actually killed in these strikes. So it's the first wave. A lot of people were, of course, speaking about World War III. So that rhetoric is back. The show's as relevant as ever, unfortunately. It's almost as if the show was actually started to cover these events, which it was. And, even Donald Trump came out with a quick clip when the strikes began, and everybody felt like it was a new Iraq war situation. So even Donald Trump said that Joe Biden is mentally unstable, mentally insane, and he will bring us into World War III if we don't re-elect Trump and actually save America and save the world. Which I think he may be partially right, but very intense situation for the Houthis. And we mentioned a few weeks ago, these guys are really tougher, if not as tough as the people of the Donetsk, Lugansk cities, as tough as the Taliban. They've held out. And in fact, if you look at the history, the Saudi Arabian Houthi war started right around the same time as the Minsk Accords, so 2015. So they're about as battle-hardened as the people of Donetsk and Lugansk, who took back Mariupol, Bakhmut, all these other cities from the incredibly overpowered, I guess you could say, through Western armaments, Ukrainian military. So the Houthis are, incredibly skilled. They've probably positioned, you notice the strikes, Conrad, on the map, they positioned their infrastructure, spread it out so well that the US and UK need to actually pinpoint target various random spots around the map in order to actually hit any sort of sustainable infrastructure of the Houthis. And this probably primarily includes military infrastructure as well as some factories where they suspect the Houthis are either storing or rearming some of these long-range missiles through which they were actually shooting the big Satan behind the scenes, which is Israel. So I kind of view this in a very funny fashion, because on one hand, I'm like, well, my sort of white history, my ancestry tells me okay, wait, these are just Middle Eastern pirates, right? They're stopping shipping lanes, they're raiding ships. This is just like the Somalian pirate situation. We have to, you have to stop them, stomp them into the ground, destroy piracy. But on the other hand, the Houthis are actually not doing this for any commercial gain. The only reason they've declared the Red Sea Straits in the south as a potential target is because they're trying to protect their own Islamic brethren from genocide and annihilation in the Middle East, in Palestine and Gaza. So their motives for actually stopping trade and for actually shooting these missiles at Israel are completely, somewhat justifiable, you could say, which is really interesting. It's not like, so I think this view that the Prosperity Guardian is trying to force upon us is that this is just like Somalian pirates. It's just about a bunch of like rowdy Middle Easterners who need to be put down. But in fact, the reality is it's actually almost the Houthis are this, second, third world humanitarian mission to the Palestinians, which now America and the UK and all these Western ships, they're trying to actually stop. So the Houthis are, they almost have actual virtue behind their actions here. And the US and the UK, well, they're fighting for money.
That's a really good way to put it because they took the leverage that they had at their disposal. They thought, we have this much equipment, we have these boats, we have these men, what can we do? And what they could do was bring the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Straits and the Gulf of Aden to a halt. And they did that. And they hit Eilat where they thought they could. Israel was right at the extent of their medium range, which is the most they have, missile range. So they launched them at Israel, they did some things. And so they're maxing out the leverage that they have at their disposal to, like you said, bring aid to their Islamic brethren in Gaza. And again, this shows you that it is about helping their Islamic brothers, but there is a deeper civilizational, ontological antipathy between specifically the Houthis, but also, of course, specifically the Shia world and then the Muslim world broadly against the Zionist entity. Because look, I mean, Hamas, Gaza, that's Sunni territory. That is, it's on the border with Egypt. This is not really part of the Shia crescent that really ends up, around Syria and Lebanon and then wraps around with Iraq, Syria, Iran, down into the Houthis being the other kind of end, I guess, of that crescent of the Shia world. But of course, the antipathy for Israel, the understanding that Israel is a perpetual threat to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Islamic heritage of Jerusalem. I mean, we're seeing this again. It's you could call it kind of ecumenical anti-Zionism or ecumenical anti-Semitism is kind of bridging some of these gaps, and we're seeing kind of a Christian consciousness like this arise. Many people may have watched the Vince James, Nick Fuentes versus Gavin McInnes, Adam King Zionism debate. And by the end of the debate, Vince and Fuentes just got Adam King, the Zionist Jew, to basically admit without even hesitation that he would eliminate Christianity from the world before he eliminated Islam. And his partner in the debate, Gavin McInnes, is Catholic and literally got up and walked away when that happened. So this sort of this understanding that whether it's Muslims understanding that, Shia, Sunni are both going to be targeted by Zionists, or Christians in the West understanding that, wow, even in the midst of the Gaza war, Jews would still side with Muslims over Christians, then yeah, I mean, maybe the battle lines have been drawn and we're just now realizing it. And I mean we as in, the unenlightened normies that are slowly but surely realizing, that we in the West have been used as a tool to wage, Talmudic war against, I mean, right now we're involved, like you said, you mentioned this is just some irrelevant group of sand pirates. Not exactly. They have a humanitarian religious aim. But at the same time, because of this whole situation and because of Israeli influence in America, we in America have been dragged into this, this sand merchant dispute, because we act as, the muscle for Israel. And of course, people have made a million comments about it. Follow Philip Pilkington. He has great economic trade routes analysis. But, the age of unlimited free trade around the world because the US, UK naval behemoth thalassocracy will protect ships, that's gone now. I mean, we have to basically expect that in any of these choke points in these relevant positions, actors that find themselves on the other end of any number of blocks, whether it's the global American bloc, whether it's some kind of Chinese bloc, there's going to be conflict and perhaps even violence for shipping rights, for trade routes, for these sorts of things. So it's all a part of this new multipolar world. But another update on these strikes, of course, they're kind of the big news item right now, and 20 plus have been confirmed killed in Yemen. Multiple of those, I believe, are civilians, so it's only going to further radicalize the already fully anti-America, anti-Israel Houthis. Like, there's probably nowhere in the world more anti-Israel, anti-America than Yemen, maybe even more so than the West Bank and Palestine, and maybe not Gaza. That's That's another topic. We're going to talk about exactly what Israel's plans are because we're getting totally contradictory claims that we need total occupation versus no plans for total occupation. So that's probably just to keep the U.S. confused so they don't come out with a full-blown condemnation. But as far as the strikes on Yemen go, Mohammed Abdul Salam, who's a Houthi spokesperson, he told Reuters that the strikes, including these ones overnight, they hit a military base in Sana'a but had no significant impact on the group's ability to prevent Israel-affiliated vessels from passing through the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea. Of course, at this point, like I said, the Houthis' response was that they will have a increased and dramatic response, so we're going to be watching for that. Of course, the news of the F-22s and supposed ships being hit and shot out of the sky have been denied by Western news outlets, but again, if America did lose an F-22, would they admit it? I mean, that's, obviously, of course, the Houthis might be going harder claiming it was true if it was, so I'm still skeptical. But again, there are all sorts of possibilities that could go down, and the U.S. is going to try to deny any of it and prevent it from reaching the public eye because that's what really stokes a big reaction and gets people, voted out of office. And of course, this is an election year, and Biden is tanking lower than was ever previously thought. We're going to get into the upcoming Iowa caucus, which of course will be, if you're listening to this on Sunday, that'll be on Monday right after you listen. So you'll get the news of how well Trump is going to do. But these strikes in Yemen, while they were, of course, ordered by the Biden regime and whatnot, apparently Lloyd Austin, supervised them himself from his hospital bed. Is this all in of course, the U.S., escalates militarily the most it has in the past, 5+ years, while the Secretary of Defense is apparently in a pretty unfortunate medical condition with some complications from a surgery for pancreatic cancer. And apparently Biden only knew about this after the surgery, and it was all sorts of. Apparently, multiple people have said that this is obvious evidence of a diplomatic feud behind the scenes and total breakdown in communication at the executive level between, you know, the White House and the State Department and the Pentagon itself. So big, I guess, trouble in Brandonville in D.C. these days. So that might be why, maybe some of these strikes are being, they're kind of trying to downplay them, but then the reporting on it was interesting. They were saying that, we're going to have a few strikes, and then the strikes got more, then they did a few strikes, and then after that, there were some really more dramatic strikes, almost with no announcement, a few 12, 24 hours later. So it's a very interesting strategy that is clearly trying to make a point and send a message to the Houthis without widening the already actively widening conflict. Because this comes as, Itamar Ben-Gvir, one of the main guys on the Israeli Security Council, talking about how we need preemptive strikes against Hezbollah. And of course, Hezbollah has dramatically increased its strikes into Israeli territory, and I believe there are more troop buildups near the border between Lebanon and Israel. So it's all coming to a head, folks, and we haven't even gotten into Greece, Turkey, and Turkey strikes on Kurdistan and some of this stuff going on. So it's a packed episode. We're gonna continue to try to get it to you. But yeah, Dimitri, what are your thoughts on the potential Houthi response? The situation in Lebanon, and I'm even hearing some reports about this Russian ship stopped, and that this may be a UAE psyop. Because if there's one country in the Middle East that's totally bucking trend and siding with unipolarity in the global Israeli-American empire, it's the United Arab Emirates. And there's actually, of course, there's the quote-unquote central government in Yemen backed by Saudis and America, which only control empty desert. There's, of course, the Houthis, which control all the relevant parts of Yemen. And then there's the Southern Transition Council, which is actually supported by the United Arab Emirates. I believe they have one of those islands down in the Gulf of Aden. I'm forgetting what it's called, but they're backed by the Emirates, like I said, and they, again, are effectively irrelevant as far as territory goes, but it's an interesting fact. So, what are your thoughts on this whole situation?
Yeah, I think we shouldn't be surprised that Qatar, the UAE, and even Saudi Arabia have their own interests in the Houthi Yemenis project, right? Naturally, you've said they have their own government officials there. They still have authority in these regions, although it's very minuscule. But the infrastructure is there for, I suppose, a full Saudi takeover if the Houthis disappear, say, tomorrow, and went back to their farms and just stopped acting like a military force similar to Hezbollah in Lebanon, right? Just like the Lebanese government kind of exists and it's pro-Western, it doesn't have any authority, right? So the Saudis have their own Lebanese government version in Yemen, although they hold pretty much no authority, and the only reason they're still alive is because the Houthis, with clemency, have allowed them to remain. In order to not spread up the war anymore. But yeah, it is. It has been reported that Qatar and Saudi Arabia actually have supported these strikes and logistically assisted the UK, France, and the US in bombing Yemen. So that's already been confirmed. Exactly how much, to which extent, we're not too sure. But this really does show that Saudi Arabia and some of these richer Arabic, Islamic Sunni countries are really between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, they need to support their Palestinian brothers in Gaza and Palestine, and attacking Houthis really isn't fulfilling that goal. On the other hand, they have their own selfish interests in Yemen with the Houthis, and in fact, they can't really set that aside. Again, these people are. I just want to say, like, we're dealing with the Islamic world. Again, there's no real, they don't have the same morals or ethics as we do, as we Orthodox Christians, for example. So we can't necessarily, view them and kind of get them to act, at least in a moral setting, in the same fashion as we would, perhaps. So again, certain backstabbing and things like that should be somewhat expected. But the UAE naturally orchestrating some sort of takeover of a Russian ship, again, possibly. But again, we've seen, like, I just want to say, worst case scenario, if a Russian ship was captured, and we're talking about a Russian commercial ship here, carrying oil between the Red Sea, Suez Canal Straits, we do have to consider the fact that Russia has been extremely patient, and Putin has been patient in his conducting of just the Ukraine war, the grain deal, things like that. Russian ships have been hit before. We've seen Ukraine hit various Russian cities, terrorist strikes, and Russia still hasn't overreacted. So, and even look, even when literal Russian citizens were captured by Hamas in Palestine and taken as hostages, was there an overreaction from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs? No. Essentially, they took it they took it on the chin, and they continued to essentially patiently hold out this big war between multipolarity, you could say, and the unipolar hegemon, which is the United States and its proxies, including Israel. So I think that's kind of the stance we're looking at here. But in terms of, yeah, like Lloyd Austin and Biden and all this breakdown in communication at the cabinet level, I think we can only call this war the war of cocaine, fentanyl, morphine, and adrenochrome, right? Because that's what's running the cabinet at the moment. It's literally painkillers and coke, right? And probably worse narcotics, which they probably obtain from these tunnels, which we keep hearing about. But that's what's running the U.S. military, and that's scary, right? It's scarier than a Bill Clinton or a George Bush, because we're literally run by madmen who wish to drag us into this Bermuda Triangle of the Gulf of Aden, and this Houthi circle, out of which maybe there'll be a few more planes that go missing in this triangle here. Like, we'll never know. Again, it's American servicemen putting their lives on the line because of some unknown trade considerations, and the fact that we say this, and you may say, "Oh, it's just rhetoric." What do you mean that all they care about is commerce? Well, look at this story. So the strikes only took place 30 hours ago, right? And instantly, one of the leading European newspapers, Defense News, actually puts out a story. This newspaper actually covers military spending, things like that, and they actually cover the French Navy defends use of million-euro missiles to down Houthi drones. So the French naval ships are actually firing defensive, the French frigates are actually firing defensive missiles at the Houthi drones, and they have to actually defend themselves. They're saying, look, so these missiles are costing this many millions of dollars. We only shot 15 missiles. How can we justify this to the French public and to the military budget of France? So again, all these people care. These people primarily care about money. It's a very usurious type of mindset that the West unfortunately has been infected with, and this won't win in the long term. We've seen this not win in Afghanistan against the Taliban, and it won't win against the Houthis in Yemen. There needs to be a more virtuous, a more justified cause. I don't believe in anything such as just war. I think that's a little bit foreign to orthodoxy. Orthodoxy views war quite neutrally. I would say neutral negative, and sometimes neutral positive, but it's never like a very there's no such thing as, I think, a justified complete crusade type of scenario. I think very rarely does that take place, right? I think in the lives of saints you can see that, but in this case, from a Western perspective, and even from a Saudi Arabian perspective, I think from an Islamic perspective, there's no justification of actually supporting the US and the UK against the Houthis in Yemen. I mean, protecting Israel is not a just cause. That's just, Israel can protect itself, if anything. Like, it's been receiving funding from America, actually, from American taxpayers for tens of years at this point.
Yeah, there's no cause for condemning the Houthis when you're not equally calling for your government to at least stop supporting Israel. They don't even have to condemn them. Just stop actively supporting what's going on in Gaza. Then, you might have the ability to be like, hey, maybe don't target, random ships that are delivering my my goods to that might make a stop in the port of Haifa. Like, look, that's what happens when your country literally supports, one of the most hated Zionist states across across the world. There's going to be some shipping issues, but even Saudi Arabia. This is on antiwar.com, is calling for the U.S. to avoid escalation in Yemen. They're talking to the White House, telling them to show restraint. They don't want them doing these strikes at all. And this is, I mean, just a few years ago, they were begging us for billions of dollars to try to bring the Houthis, Ansar Allah, to its knees. So it just shows you how much solidarity and how much pressure, I guess, the Islamic people have on their government in this, Gaza issue. Of course, Saudi Arabia is always losing face to Iran on this issue. Iran already more militarily powerful, much larger population. And Saudi Arabia sees that if Iran has the support of the rest of the Muslim world and sees them as an active supporter of Israel, then in a future, and by future I mean maybe right now, broadening hot conflict in the region, Iran will take advantage of that and march into Saudi Arabia and, relaunch the Persian Empire and, take out the House of Saud and have the kingdom no longer be the, I guess, progenitors of the Islamic faith and the guardians of Mecca and whatnot. And this would all come at a time when Jerusalem's status is in question as well. So very eschatological very quickly there. But the fact that Saudi Arabia is very much encouraging the U.S. to show restraint shows you how much this realignment has really manifested. But at the same time, you mentioned, the French strikes and how expensive these are. Now that the U.S. has turned this Operation Prosperity Guardian into an expanded hot military operation, again, they're two separate things, but from the same government, so of course they're going to be linked together. The Germans have now decided to join Operation Prosperity Guardian. They've sent the frigate Hessen, which is a pretty powerful naval ship, to the Red Sea, which is going to be helping the U.S. and Greece and the Seychelles protect, Maersk ships, or I guess Maersk has suspended shipping. Most other companies have, but whatever ships are still making it through there, help protect them, get to ports in Israel, ports in the Mediterranean, and whatnot. So Germany has entered the fray, but at the same time, Iran has seized a U.S. tanker in retaliation, and this is a tanker that earlier last year, 2023, the U.S. seized from Iran and parked it off the coast of Texas, and then it was carrying oil on a different mission for the U.S. now, and Iran basically stole it back. So again, big escalations. Iran has said that they support the Houthis, so they're kind of asserting themselves in this region, in these gulfs outside of the Red Sea, outside of the Persian Gulf, showing that it isn't just the U.S. and these other Western powers that can freely navigate these waters. Of course, we are the countries that actually have our borders here, so they're asserting themselves. So the regional conflict is very much has all the relevant actors involved and on the periphery, physically speaking. So it's getting interesting to say the least. Of course, we got to get into these Chabad tunnels, unless there's anything else in the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, Eastern Mediterranean that we're missing, Dimitri.
No, I think it's completely, the Chabad tunnels actually play into this very, very accurately because again, we're discussing the same religion which essentially forced this conflict upon us in the first place. So I think it's, although it may seem like a U.S. domestic issue, I think it very much has ties to foreign policy, considering just how the media has covered all these conflicts in a very biased fashion, and then how the media again swishes its attention to the tunnels found in New York and exactly what kind of coverage they received.
Yeah, of course, anybody on the internet saw the coverage of the secret tunnel supposedly found, not supposedly, we know, the secret tunnel found under the Chabad Lubavitch World Headquarters, the 770 Synagogue and Jewish Cultural Center, which yours truly, Conrad Franz here, I used to live 2 blocks from this building. I would walk by it all the time on my way to the subway, and it was on Eastern Parkway in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. I would see it all the time. And so most of the people in the Hasidim that I lived around were Lubavitchers, were Chabad, and they all flew the gold and purple Moshiach crown flag, and they loved Rebbe Schneerson. There was murals of him everywhere. And over the course of living in New York and living there, the city slowly cracked down on their, Yom Kippur celebrations and the chicken murder, because sometimes earlier the chickens were just left in the streets to rot, and now they've forced them to do them in tents and stuff like that, and slightly, keep that bizarre evil ritual a little bit more private and clean. But what happened was these tunnels were found under this historic synagogue, and we remember we reported on Javier Milei coming to America, going to Chabad Lubavitch World Headquarters. That's this place. Like, Milei was just here, and supposedly these tunnels were constructed, 6, 7 months ago. the media is saying they were dug by illegal immigrants, but you piece it all together, it basically comes out that the Chabad, Jews were paying these illegal immigrants to, and we've gotten all sorts of narratives from Gavin McInnes types. They're gaslighting us, saying it was for them to hide during a future pandemic like COVID so they could worship. The Jews are saying it was to expand the building, and maybe they're going to try to say it was just to avoid some kind of zoning contract law. But again, they've got lawyers for this. They could work that kind of stuff out. They're Jews, so the fact that this was the secret tunnel, and of course we saw the videos of the blood-stained, dirty mattresses, of the high chairs, of these things being pulled out, it starts to paint a much grimmer picture. And of course we all saw the video of a very I guess a mouse-like creature crawling out of a sewer grate outside of Chabad World Headquarters. This Hasidic guy was, he crawled through the grate and people were filming it, and over 12 people were arrested and pulled out of these tunnels that had been concealed by these wooden panels inside the main hall of the synagogue. And this guy jumps up and he slaps the camera, tries to get it away, and runs off into the night. But I just have to say that these images alone going viral everywhere. Of course, the original Orthodox Jewish news account that posted about this deleted all of the original posts because of the obvious implications. And I just have to say, Jonathan Greenblatt, the ZOA, all of these Jewish, organizations dedicated to fighting anti-Semitism, they were all just looking at this, I guarantee you, in, their secret underground layers somewhere. And we're like, man, hundreds of millions of dollars, years of progress, we made Schindler's List, we made all these films, and it's just down the drain. Just all right down the toilet, because now there's a video with hundreds of millions of views of some Hasidic guy crawling out of the sewer in Brooklyn. So it was a big L for the image, I guess, of world Jewry. Because again, we have these right-wing, Bapsphere types obfuscating this, saying, all these random Talmud readers are nothing more than another base. Might as well be random Muslims reading the Quran. These aren't the same as the Soros types that are influencing, Sumner Redstone types that are influencing media, that are influencing finance and everything. It's like, but they are. Why is Javier Milei meeting with these people? Why is Beryl Lazar and these people? Why are these people considered Putin's personal rabbis? Why does Trump meet with them? Why do they meet with the leaders of the UK, the leaders of the EU, the president of literally every country? Why are they meeting with these Chabad people if they're nothing more than just some wayward Bedouins and their weird rags and their weird rituals? Sure, there's some Hasidim that are probably pretty low on the relative pole of Jewish power, but again, as the point was made in the debate with Fuentes and Vince James against McInnes and the other character, they all reject the resurrection and lordship of Jesus Christ. So in that, they are very much a collective. So it's important to keep that in mind. And sure, while there is no direct evidence that these tunnels had child rape or anything like that occurring in them, we do have, and this is from Kyle Undercover, and again, this whole area is just almost an entirely Hasidic neighborhood with some black tenantry. Like, obviously, all the property is owned by Hasidim, and some of these places are rented out to blacks. And then you have gentrifiers like me slowly moving in there every once in a while. But this is from Kyle Undercover on Twitter. He says, unexplored Jewish tunnels proven to lead south in the exact direction of 394 Kingston Avenue. Walked on Kingston Avenue all the time myself. This is 900 feet away from the 770 Chabad HQ. And this location was directly linked to a child rape case from 2 months ago, and there's full court documents linked here, and we'll have those linked below, I guess. But this is real stuff. I mean, again, the fact that this all just came out and it was effectively self-reported by the Jewish community because it was a riot. Like they were doing the oy vey, what are you doing? You're oppressing us, NYPD. You're doing a fascism, because they were arresting them, basically preventing them from doing whatever they wanted. There was the famous video of the cop like, where are you from, Israel? Yeah, we don't do this in America. I wanna clear the whole shul out. That video went viral, and everyone was talking about some Italian cop. And yeah, the story kind of took the world by storm. And of course, an even bigger part of the story became the fact that 90% of the establishment conservative commentariat either didn't talk about it at all, despite it getting millions of impressions and objectively being valuable for anybody posting on Twitter to post about, because it would get you followers, it would get you engagement. Or they were like downplaying it, like, wow, I love these Jews for making these tunnels. Like, this is amazing. Like, it just comes out of nowhere with the, like, yes, I support this. Like, couldn't you at least come at it neutrally? So it really betrayed a sort of reality of the current conservative establishment, and how, while some are willing to criticize, left-wing secular Jewry, these Hasidim and some of these Kabbalistic characters are still above board for some people for some reason.
Yeah, it's very bizarre. I think we did see a lot of conservative voices actually come out and support and kind of try to reinforce the anti-COVID crowd and just say, "Oh well, these Orthodox Jews are also part of that crowd. These are members of Hasidic Chabad and Kabbalah." Even though if they explained exactly what these religions were and what was written in the Talmud, I think a lot of the anti-vax, anti-COVID pandemic crowd would actually turn against them. These conservative commentators, but I do want to mention just the fact that sewers, tunnels, what exactly was malicious or suspicious about all of this? Well, frankly, there was footage released of the actual tunnels, probably from the police as they explored them. What was exactly in these tunnels, and there was a baby stroller, some weird books, a lot of garbage, lots of really interesting, bizarre stuff that you probably wouldn't have in a religious tunnel. Even a few years ago, in which you held worship or which led to this mitzvah across the street, which is like a religious Jewish bathhouse, which they use. A lot of mitzvahs in the past were used for very nefarious things, as we've heard from various stories around Europe. Worth doing your research actually into that. But sewers, tunnels. I think it led me to at least remember the famous Russian imperial case of 1911, 1913, the case of Bayless and the killing, of course, I would say the martyrdom of Saint Andrew of Kiev, Andrusha Yushinsky, who was killed and actually, mysteriously in a ritual murder in right before Russia went into World War One, and his body was found actually in a cave next to an abandoned mine shaft. So very interesting analogy there of the Alapayevsk martyrs and of course the Ganyana Yama, all those killings at Yekaterinburg later of the royal Romanov families. It's always like near mine shafts, near caves. This is where this sort of stuff takes place. But his body was found there. Eventually it led to a very popular, shall we say, anti-Semitic prosecution trial, where I'm actually translating a text right now. One of the best books written in 1914 actually was published on this particular trial, because the outcome was very debatable and contestable, but there were a lot of very interesting experts that came forward, and especially archimandrites and monks from the Kiev Pechersk Lavra, from the Pachayev Lavra, and even Catholic priests from like Estonia and Lithuania, who actually attested to the fact that these ritualistic murders are completely, they are possible. These were expert witnesses, Orthodox ones, and including the father of Igor Sikorsky, the inventor of the helicopter. His father was a famous Russian Orthodox psychologist from Kiev, Ivan Sikorsky. He was actually an expert witness who appeared before the court there to justify the fact that, look, it is for the prosecution. He actually argued and gave a really, really powerful speech, despite being literally 90 years of age. He says, look, it is possible for these ritual murders to take place. There are people of this mindset, especially from this particular community. Very interesting trial, worth looking into. And the other story, I think, which should raise some eyebrows, right? We'll post the story from Los Angeles Times in the description on Substack, but there was the death of 5 children in Krasnoyarsk. Essentially, if you look at the map of Russia, it's right in the center of Russian Siberia, a very cold city right next to one of the largest regions. And in 2005, they found 5 children in noticed in a sewer pipe. The children, 2 of them had completely no blood. They were drained completely. All 5 bodies of the children were burnt, and burnt to such an extent that they could not identify them until they had to DNA test them. So completely disfigured. The authorities surprisingly stopped all criminal investigations of the murder of 5 children after about 18 months, so 1.5 years in, which is very unusual. And the reasons they cited was the fact that there were no suspects in the case. So Krasnoyarsk in 2005 to 2007, the Russian police could not find any suspects. Literally, the Russian equivalent of the FBI also could not find any suspects. But 5 children were killed, 2 of them drained of blood. This is a very famous case in Russia, which was hushed up very, very quickly. So, but again, found in the sewage pipes next to a series of caves and tunnels. This is very... These things happen, and so let's not be surprised. And when you see the stained mattress, things like that, these are very nefarious things that happen in these places. And even if this tunnel was used for these sort of things years ago, right, maybe even during the COVID pandemic, it still doesn't justify the fact that it wasn't investigated properly, and there was no forensic testing. There was no, I mean, it would be, think about it, it would be considered anti-Semitic for the police to even assert something of that sort. So again, it's not like the police are bad. I'm sure there are people on the inside who control the police force of New York and Brooklyn who actually, prevent them from investigating properly. But in fact, even asserting something of this sort would be considered inappropriate. So it's very this whole tunnel story is just very very dark, and I don't want to downplay this at all. This is not. This the fact that this story came out, as Conrad said, was because of a dispute, and essentially the Jewish community, they don't have the grace of God upon them. They don't. They believe in literal Kabbalistic black magic. So let's just not downplay it at all. The Holy Spirit is not present in this shul, in these caves. It's a place of desolation and a place of dark ritual. So the fact that they're fighting amongst themselves and actually revealing to the public, revealing to the police that there are these secret tunnels and they're infighting in the community, and this causes this great revelation, which is red pilling and revealing to the whole world that, hey, some of these old stories we used to hear about are maybe real and somewhat mysterious. Maybe we should look into it. Is just the fact that when you're separated from God, bad things happen. These people are playing with demons. They're playing with the demonic forces, and naturally, this leads to bad outcomes. Because again, demons, hell is a democracy, right? Which means there's a lot of
Mhm.
infighting. Not all the demons agree, so there's various parties. It's just like the Knesset. But yeah, very interesting revelation at the beginning of 2024.
Now, you mentioned the horrible situation in Krasnoyarsk, and that was only a few years after the 1993 martyrdom of the three New Optina martyrs who were killed in a satanic ritual as well, where there was some kind of blood nonsense involved. So again, listen to that on, I believe it's episode 3 of Ether Hours. So that's a great episode. But you mentioned their bodies in Krasnoyarsk were in the sewer. We've talked about the Romanovs, allegedly bodies thrown in a mine shaft. We see now these tunnels under the shul. We have all this other stuff. I mean, these are mole people, man. I mean, like these are bizarre mole people. They're building tunnels, they're connecting places, they're transporting things. I've talked about, the hermetic reality of the crossroads and mercantile transportation and everything. And they've taken this to a whole new level. Like they're transporting, it's whether it's children or whether it's whether they're doing black magic rituals under there. Yeah, like you said, it's a very nefarious situation, and this ties into, like, ironically enough, these days, we're back to, pre-World War II, where the Russian is the number one enemy of the Jew. But besides that, of course, there is the German, the other landed imperial character on the continent. And we covered the Reich. It was that episode I did by myself when we were just getting started on the show, and then we covered it later. The Reichsbürger movement, the supposed crypto monarchist violent overthrow of the Reichstag that was being planned by, what was it, like 27,000 Germans supposedly, and it was centered around Prince Royce, who is this German royal figure who wants to revive the Second German Empire, the Second Reich, I guess is what they called it. And part of their theory was, that there were these mole people underground with these children, and these mole children that were being trafficked and being abused and being used in rituals. And again, people were like, "Oh, these are just crazy QAnon type, Germans." They really kind of tried to bring the QAnon J6 type thing into Germany and use their heavy-handed Federal Office of the Constitution to shut down boomers and these more religious Germans and these perhaps, J-pilled Germans that were, had accepted the reality that we can't, have anything to do with Hitler, so let's go back to the Second Reich. These people were shut down totally by this investigation, which again, I'm skeptical of how much Prince Royce and these people were actually seriously planning to use guns to violently overthrow the Reichstag. But it appears they may have been totally spot on about these mole people and about these children and about all this kind of stuff. So there really might be more to that than meets the eye. We're going to be keeping an eye on that. But this comes as part of why that is relevant is because the AfD, which is the political party that most of these Reichsbürger people would be voting for, is surging in Germany to the point where if formerly Merkel's, now the lesser known, Christian Democratic Union, the center-right party in Germany, they have a rule across their party to not caucus, to not form coalition with the AfD, but there's a section of that party that is believed that they could break away, form their own smaller party, would have enough support with the AfD's 40% to form a majority coalition and prevent the Christian Democratic Union from being involved at all, which would be fantastic because those are already that party that would break away is the more traditional right-wing element of the CDU. Them joining the AfD would prevent even more moderating influence being brought into that coalition. But of course, amidst all of this, it was like 25 people went to this event spoken at by Martin Sellner, who is sort of he's from Austria. He's the Generation Identity leader, kind of the main identitarian activist in Europe right now. And he gave a speech and a few AFD politicians were in attendance, and now that's being used by members of the SPO and the Green Party, who are the ruling coalition right now, to say that, oh, because of this, we can ban the whole party. And they just realize how well the AFD is going to do in some of these state elections and the federal elections, and how they're boosting the identitarian right wing bloc in the European Parliament as well, which right now only has about 76 or so members of the European Parliament. It's much smaller than the EPP, which is like the center right bloc, which has Maloney and some of these other characters. But the ID identitarian bloc is going to have a big expansion now with, I think, the Netherlands main party is in that. Of course, the AFD is in that, and a few other parties across Europe that are doing well are part of that bloc. And in general, Germany, the right is surging, and that's by far the scariest country for the right to be surging in for the globalists, for obvious reasons. So we're going to be keeping a close eye on upcoming German local and federal elections because it's looking promising finally for the Germans. Of course, Poland was a disappointment. We saw the liberals are back in power. Of course, the Law and Justice Party didn't do themselves any favors, totally aligning with NATO and whatnot. But we were disappointed that Confederatia didn't do better because they were much more identitarian and monarchist. But in the midst of all of this, Finland is, beefing up its NATO allegiances, and Turkey has advanced, the Sweden vote to its parliament, although it's still slowballing it. We may not see Sweden fully into NATO for a few months now, but it appears to be happening. And I believe the defense secretary of Sweden or something like that, he said that we need to prepare for a war in Sweden. Like he said this just to the Swedish people, effectively referencing Russia. So it's definitely being seeded in the mind of the Scandinavian people that they may be kind of recruited into this war against Russia. But the other things going on the continent, in Germany as well, there are these big farmer protests, which, all the German politicians are warning the farmers not to go far right, which is kind of what happened in the Netherlands. The farmers all came out for a right wing, immigration restrictionist leader in Geert Wilders, and now these farmers seem to be probably much more aligned with the AFD. And these farm protests have spread to places, Austria and then places like Romania, which are kind of doing the same thing the Polish farmers and truckers did, which was blockade the Ukrainian border crossing, because I'm sure Ukrainian surplus is putting some of these Romanian farmers to ruin. So the fallout and disdain for Ukraine continues to grow, which takes us to Ukraine itself, which not as hot as the Middle East this week, but there are still some developments.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of Russian troops actually pushing, still trying to constrict Avdiivka, the Ukrainians are actually putting up an intense resistance. Right before the new year, we actually received footage. We didn't report on this earlier, in fact, because it was such a small story, but we did actually witness Zelensky appear on the outskirts of Avdiivka itself. So the man has gonads. He's a little bit ruthless. In many ways, those analogies to the Joker from Batman, they really he is a clown, he's a comedian, and he likes to appear in the front lines because he knows there is some sort of shall we say, like, Talmudic immunity on his head. Like, for some reason Russia doesn't want to take this guy out for whatever reason. Unlike Putin, who simply cannot appear on the front lines, under any means, or even Patriarch Kirill, for example. These are all legitimate targets. But Zelensky apparently isn't. So he's appeared at Avdiivka, and Avdiivka is still holding strong. In fact, on three ends, on the southwestern end, it's holding the Russians back. On the northeastern end, it's just holding the outskirts of Avdiivka proper and the railroad leading out of the city, which essentially connects Avdiivka to the rest of mainland Ukrainian held territory, and as well as just in the southeastern point, actually Ukrainians are holding it back. We are hearing Russian troops, at least, building up a certain portion of resistance on the outskirts of Kharkov, so near Belgorod, the long-suffering Belgorod, which received missile strikes just on New Year's Eve, and many Russian civilians were killed. A lot of them are still hospitalized there, so a great tragedy, and essentially a terrorist attack upon literal civilian targets, which we reported on earlier. But so Belgorod being that sister city to Kharkov, we can definitely see whenever Kharkov is the next target in the northeast of Ukraine, Russia will be defending its essentially 50 kilometers away, the city of Belgorod, and Russia will be essentially probably pursuing a surround type tactic when things escalate. But at the moment, like, we have seen essentially a stalemate on that end. But where one particular area where a stalemate hasn't taken place, and this was reinforced. We've seen almost 2 weeks of no active videos of persecutions. Again, a Ukrainian CCTV footage comes out of a Ukrainian church in center western Ukraine actually being raided by, again, Ukrainian military and members of this, of the fake schismatic Zelensky church, which is incredibly disturbing. It's really sad on like a Saturday evening seeing parishioners actually getting dragged out of church from a mountains or a Vespers service, and essentially the church being taken over. They're probably grabbing the anti-mints as well off the altar table. I mean, as sacrilegious as that sounds, this is exactly what's happening in these particular places. These people are very skilled. They're skilled schismatics. I don't know what else to say, like skilled blasphemers. And the other thing was, naturally, we saw footage of and then this kind of went viral. We did post it on Telegram and on Twitter. There was footage of a Ukrainian schismatic priest attempting to cross himself, and very visibly, it wasn't. I mean, again, you could argue it was because of physical constriction, but he was trying to cross himself and he really couldn't do it. In fact, outside of a church which him and his men, by men I mean literal soldiers, just captured the day before, and he's praying alongside his parishioners, just trying to cross himself and he can't. His hand doesn't lift up. This is what we hear about from Saint Seraphim of Sarov stories and other stories of lives of Saint John of Kronstadt, Saint Theophan the Recluse. Demons prevent you from saying your prayers, from crossing yourselves. This is a real sign of possession. I don't know what else to say, but this is what happens when you step away from Christ. Is that they just interfere with your life physically as well as mentally. So really unfortunate footage, but yeah, in terms of the diocesan control, the Russian Orthodox Church has in fact granted a temporary diocese to, as we know, the Kherson Oblast is divided into two. So the Bishop of Kherson is actually in Kherson, but he has no ability to govern the Russian Orthodox Church and his priests on the Russian side of the Dnieper River. And so the Russian Orthodox Church, the synod came together, or those members who could make it, and they essentially put forward a decision. I think it was probably Patriarch Kirill, his personal decision to create a temporary diocesan control on the Russian side of the Dnieper and Kherson Oblast. So at least the Russian priests will have some sort of governing authority at this point, some administrative assistance, and also the priests can actually go to confession and actually confess their sins, and the deacons as well. So it's it does assist in that, having that sort of hierarchical oversight. So it's positive developments, and those sort of things, Conrad, they do move us to think, if the Russian Church is setting up alternative diocesan control of these particular areas, maybe they are anticipating, because we know the Russian military and Vladimir Putin don't always report their future plans to the Russian Orthodox Church. Maybe the church is anticipating some sort of temporary truce or some sort of armistice, some sort of agreement for peace. And in fact, they're saying, look, if this takes place, we're going to need temporary control, which kind of goes out of the ordinary, at least for the church.
Yeah, it's a horrible thing to see. I saw the video in, I think it was Viritsa, where the priest and the parishioners were dragged out later at night, and it's terrible to see. So again, keep the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in your prayers. But to wrap up in Ukraine, some sad news. We've talked about him on the show before. It appears that, as reported on the Tucker Carlson network show by his father, Gonzalo Lira Sr., Gonzalo Lira Jr., the American Chilean commentator. Again, I knew Gonzalo Lira, Coach Red Pill, before anyone was talking about anything to do in Ukraine. He was a figure within, right-wing circles, blood sports, the manosphere, these kinds of communities. And he is now apparently dead. Apparently he died from, I guess, his illnesses in a Ukrainian prison at the age of 55. So a real tragedy. I remember when he attempted to flee, I believe, to the Czech or Hungarian border. And he, I guess, was unsuccessful and was captured. And we all remember the weird transsexual Mr. Sarah Ashton Cirillo, whatever that cross-dressing freak's name was, talking about gleefully about how Gonzalo Lira will be tortured in prison and all this horrible stuff. So the American government has allowed one of its citizens to effectively die at the hands of its puppet regime. And I guess we'll see if they say anything, but I'm skeptical.
Yeah, I think it's definitely Mr. Lira was a victim of Ukrainian torture, just like many of those protesters in 2014, 2015 in Odessa and other places. We have to understand that SBU is probably one of the most notorious, and its ancestors, its sort of forefathers are definitely, we're talking about CIA and the most ruthless Mossad agents who've actually built this organization up. And also, like, it has the most tainted ancestry of any foreign intelligence agency in the world. I think we have a bit of Mossad. Definitely, the Ukrainian military does have very strong ties to that of the Israeli military. We've heard Zelensky actually allow Israeli police officers into Ukraine before in order to protect, that particular Hasidic pilgrimage that was taking place. It's very bizarre sort of behavior, naturally. So we do know the security services interact with one another. And again, CIA have been in Ukraine for literally 10 years at this point, if not more. On the other hand, there is that KGB ancestry as well, right? So we have to keep that in mind. And Ukraine was one of the places where the Red Terror and those sort of events, the Cheka, OGPU, and NKVD, they really dealt a massive blow to orthodoxy and even just the white Russian Christian population of the Ukrainian region. With I don't want to just say Holodomor, like sort of throw it out like that PR word that it is, but a lot of Christians were killed in those particular areas, and these agencies, unfortunately, in Ukraine, I don't think it received the same sort of enlightenment as the FSB maybe did with proper leadership. FSB really transitioned into something, at least, that attempts to fight for positive forces and has changed itself internally. But the SBU, no, I think they've continued their really harsh prosecution as well as even persecution of, and we've seen this in the churches, right? So their actual reaction to church hierarchs and how they've raided churches and raided bishops, things like that. And now, of course, Gonzalo Lira dying within one of their cells is not surprising at all. I think, as sad as it is, it's like kind of expected that they would kill a famous journalist very much in the open, maybe sending a message of sorts. These people are very dangerous, and I mean, people like myself and Conrad and any of the Jay Dyer, maybe Father John Whiteford, people who actually speak out openly against the persecution that things are taking place in Ukraine, we would not be allowed to actually go to that state. It is incredibly dangerous. We have to just keep in mind this is not a democracy. It's not some sort of liberal haven. In fact, Julian Assange has shown that even Western countries aren't really safe at this point. But Ukraine is definitely the place where all these agencies act with complete impunity, unmanaged. There's no auditing going on. People just die, disappear, or are jailed, and then they die from various illnesses they receive. So it's quite horrible, I think, and it does paint a very accurate picture of what's happening in that at the moment very cursed land and very desolate region.
Yeah, I think to move away to an even more right now, I don't know about desolate, but seemingly cursed region, I was talking to Tristan Haggard about the Ecuador Civil War. Again, we're not experts on South American politics here, but Ecuador has descended into a sort of low-grade insurgent civil war conflict where these gangs, this assortment of cartel-affiliated, certain cartels groups are warring with each other, but are also both fighting the government. And they took over TV stations, they took over all sorts of places, universities, took hostages, were executing guards and whatnot. And the president declared war, like literal war. He sent the army out. They were in the streets doing all this sort of stuff. And, well, according to Tristan Haggard, there's even a kind of Santa Muerte, demonic, satanic element in these cartels that have seeped down in from the influence of the Mexican cartels, the Mexican mafia, which now run all of the drug trade in South America. They have kind of amassed this influence and sort of made a move on what they perceived as a weaker government. But Noboa, the president of Ecuador, I'm told at least, has the opportunity to go really heavy-handed and become the new, I guess, Bukele of South America and become very popular because the last two presidents were U.S. puppets, and he himself has a more independent support base and is capable of perhaps forging a more, authoritarian, low-crime, somewhat conservative path forward for Ecuador. So that's our Civil War report on Ecuador, unless you have any comments, Dimitri. But I wanted to talk about the case against Israel in the International Court of Justice, not so much because we love the International Court of Justice, but because, like we just said, we talked about the atrocities Ukraine has been perpetrating for months now, and of course Russia is the one for supposedly kidnapping children that gets taken to the International Court of Justice, and that prevented Putin from supposedly being able to travel to the BRICS summit in South Africa. But South Africa now is the BRICS country that has taken Israel to the International Court of Justice right now. So what's the take here? How does this develop? How is this development going to affect kind of the broader geostrategic situation?
I think it's somewhat of a positive development considering that Israel actually elected 5 to 6 counselors and attorneys representing itself in this court, which means it does recognize the jurisdiction of the court to some regard, to some extent, and also just looking at the argumentation. I think if anybody wants to follow this story, we all know what South Africa and what the actual applicants to the court will be accusing Israel of, right? But what we will be seeing here, I think, is just Israel defending itself very it in a very interesting fashion. So on one hand, I've primarily watched the Israeli side of the arguments, and they've actually presented some, some very obvious virtue signaling plots to this particular scenario. They've stated that they have the right to self defense. Naturally, that the October 7th, they made a very clear emphasis on October 7th and the fact that the strikes against the Israeli kibbutzes has forced the Israeli military to act, in the strongest fashion and essentially institute a counter-terrorist operation of like the largest proportions all over Gaza, and that was essentially what not justified but somewhat at least alleviated the guilt and intent of genocide. They've said there is no intent of actual genocidal action here. You can interpret it as a genocide if you want, but they think genocide, the actual definition of the word, is a little bit broad in the ICJ sense. There was a few disputes about what exactly does genocide mean, and looking at the definition myself, it is quite broad, but I think the word can be applied very broadly as well. So, in fact, genocide, I think is a real thing, and what Israel is doing, it really meets the criteria. But was there any intent? Israel is arguing that no, there wasn't. It's also stating that yes, we were actually allowing humanitarian aid to enter into Palestine and Gaza, in fact, this entire time, and they're presenting evidence against that. But mostly the arguments actually of the Israeli side and the ICJ are hinging on this. October 7th was so bad that we needed this extraordinary action, and we needed to destroy the terrorist organization of Hamas, as they're calling it, with complete impunity and almost, with direct action by the military, things like that. So I think the ICJ, look, the ICJ, we mentioned it in our wrap up of 2023 episode that these particular courts, they're not the most legitimate authorities, right? Look at The Hague. They're looking for Igor Strelkov. They want to arrest people like Putin, like Matushka Maria Lvova Belova, the Commissioner for Children's Rights in Russia. Meanwhile, children are going missing in tunnels and things like that. But nevertheless, these people, they're issuing warrants for people completely, essentially innocent of any crimes. They want to investigate Russian, essentially any Russian politician who manages to get captured into their claws. A lot of really weird warrants coming out of these particular courts, the ICC and the ICJ. So how much can we Christians view this particular process as something authoritative? I'm not too sure, but at least in a legal sense, at least in the media and maybe in the eyes of the international community, it will reveal the fact that Israel is in fact at fault, legally speaking. And will Israel accept the orders and decisions of this court? Again, even if these procedures, right, this is not like a proper civil court or like a district court in the US where it may take months and years to actually get this process going. No, the decision, of the judges, of the panel of the judges will come out within, I think, 5 to 6 weeks. So we're already, 1 or 2 weeks into it, and it's going to come out very quickly. I think by early March, by Great Lent, we'll have the decision of the ICJ in relation to Israel, which again, I think Israel will appeal. So we know how these legal processes work. Unfortunately, the legal field is very much infested by these sort of people who just push things out. And, we've seen this in the Epstein case, right? With Alan Dershowitz, the most famous, and you can say probably the best American defense attorney, actually working for one of the most obvious and greatest pedophile child trafficker in America, right? And naturally we have owners of pornographic websites as well, the ordained rabbi running all these and he's also a defense attorney. It's just, we are seeing this very interesting pattern here where the legal profession really isn't a battleground on which I think Christians could actually win, because again, the entire system is corrupt from the inside. Jurisprudence works with these sort of people, and the ICJ, as valiant as South Africa is, actually bringing Israel to court, and I mean that's very commendable. I'm not saying it's a waste of time, but again, what outcomes will we see? I don't think we'll see anything. In fact, Netanyahu, I think the only thing he cares about is the Supreme Court of Israel actually condemning him, not some international court, unfortunately. So I think he's planning on actually winning this conflict and maybe winning back the trust of his people rather than what happened somewhere in South Africa. But nevertheless, Israel is represented, and we'll look forward to a decision maybe in early March, and we'll see what takes place.
Yeah, as far as international law goes, the ICC, the idea of international law, certainly the idea of international criminal law, is already fairly dubious to begin with, I think. I mean, there's no, there nations and their law, whether it's English common law or like the French, loyal legal tradition, these other places, it all kind of comes out of a civilizational history. There's no international civilizational history. It's this sort of Enlightenment, liberal, internationalist idea of, with ideas of racism and whatnot baked into the cake. I mean, like, you're never going to see the ICC or the ICJ prosecute South Africa for perpetuating white genocide, which, again, it's an interesting dynamic. I think some of the more radical elements within the coalition of leftist communist groups in South Africa are actually backed by the United States, like the EFF, Julius Malema, the actual kill the Boer people. Those are, MI6 Western operations influencing the, for better or for worse, you know, communist in more independent ANC, which I have no love for the ANC, but it's an African country. They're going to be Africans. But as far as the ICC and the ICJ go, their targets, like you said, are always, with the exception of South Africa bringing this forward, it kind of has civil rights clout as a black former apartheid country. It's always against Russia and Vladimir Putin for the children thing. It's always against China for the Uyghurs and whatnot, despite the fact that China is very much trying to act as a force for peace, genuinely speaking. Like, they're too afraid to even take righteous action in some cases. And we see possibly the end of the Myanmar civil war recently with China mediating talks between the junta and the Three Brotherhood Alliance, which we've talked about on the show in the past, which is effectively the largest rebel group that I think receives support from the West. Of course, there's some Islamic groups in the northwest of the country that give them grief, but this is one of the biggest groups fighting the junta, and it appears there's a ceasefire, so China is trying to maintain the junta in power and not allow Myanmar to fall to becoming a Western-backed puppet like it had been before the junta pulled the coup and took over. So that's an interesting, I guess, victory for Chinese influence in the region. And this comes amidst Taiwan's elections right across the straits on, what America recognizes as Chinese territory. Taiwan they got about 40% of the vote, and not that many people participated in the vote. So this character who's very pro Taiwan independence, as opposed to the more pro status quo Kuomintang and then the other centrist party, he's now the president of Taiwan, and they're very pro-independence, pro-liberal democracy. They take influence from the liberal Hong Kong independence movement that was protesting against the Chinese security law a few years back. People remember all of that when that went down, the umbrella protests and whatnot. But as far as Taiwan's current trajectory goes, China has made it clear that they're not happy about this and that any kind of assertion of Taiwanese independence is wrong. And I believe they've increased certain tariffs because, again, China and Taiwan are some of each other's largest trading partners still. I mean, Taiwan imports most of its stuff from mainland China, sends most of its stuff back to mainland China, exporting as well. So they have the ability to have strong influence on the Taiwanese economy. But this comes amidst Chinese, aggression in the sea and the air. They've flown planes over. They've done military exercises around Taiwan and have made it very clear. And Xi made it clear in his New Year's address that Taiwan will be fully reintegrated and normalized as part of the People's Republic of China in the very near future. And as far as the possibility of that happening politically and totally non-violently, we've talked about that possibility in the past, how it's very likely. That took a bit of a step back with this election, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if in Taiwan it was a strong coming out of forces which actually wanted unity with China, then I think, and with minimal resistance, if that actually came out of this election, then we would probably see maybe something to take place in 2024. But at this point, it'll most likely be delayed. And China, like, people view China, due to I think mostly mass media and the fact that the economy is actually rising in the 21st century as this particular dangerous force in Asia, as this big, Chinese tiger or something, or a dragon, or who knows what it is, right? In the year of the dragon at the moment. But China, historically, we have to just keep in mind its foreign policy is 95% defensive. I don't think China has pretty much invaded almost any of its allies, especially so China's one of its greatest neighbors, Russia in the north. China has never ever had a war with Russia in terms of has never invaded its territory, never had any conflict whatsoever, which is completely the opposite of what we see, say, in European history, in the Middle Eastern history, where there's constant warfare. China is this massive, I guess, Confucius civilization, which is built on peace, and it has its own philosophy, which I think a lot of countries really miss out on. And you can imagine what a future Christian China would look like for the region. I mean, it would be a complete enlightening experience, I think. So we look forward towards particular, that particular dimension of it. We've spoken about North Korea actually positioning itself very strongly against South Korea. And if China starts doing that towards Taiwan, it will be a step out of the ordinary. But I think China will only do that if the opportunity presents itself, and if the US is really spread thin amongst all of these different avenues around the world. If the US has to intervene in Ecuador or the Essequibo region, the Red Sea, Ukraine, all these places, including Israel, again in the Mediterranean. If China sees an opening, I'm not leaving out of, there is a possibility that they will act upon Taiwan, but I think most likely this conflict will be delayed until maybe early next year.
Well, it's true that they see these strikes on Yemen or these possible incursions into the Caribbean and Haiti or into South America or into Africa to help, the French colonial influence there, whatever it is. Russia saw that and immediately launched Kinjal hypersonics and kind of escalated the missile warfare. Like you said before, hit Kharkov, hit Kiev, like we had mentioned earlier. So everybody is watching how spread thin the homosexual American empire is spread around the world, in the Middle East, in Europe, in South America, in Asia, protecting Taiwanese interests. So, of course, American interest in Taiwan is what it is, but this is a wide swath of spheres to be covering and having dominion over. So everybody is waiting and watching for it to crack and helping push on it a little bit, of course. But you mentioned how China, like you said, is going to have to probably wait a little bit on their diplomatic moves on Taiwan. The same can't be said for talks between the Koreas. And just very recently, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, he said at a year-end meeting of his ruling party, he said that he ordered a decisive policy change in relations to the South, instructing the military to be prepared to pacify and occupy the South in the event of a crisis. So Kim Jong-un and the Juche boys are in full preparation for Korean integration, and it will not be into the Western system. So, the Korean War is back. So it's just another, look, World War is now. Is anybody disputing this at this point? If you're a real World War now warrior at this point, you knew this was true, but, send the show around, listen to the old episodes, go back and give those a listen, because I can assure you, we were right on the money. But unless you have anything else in Asia, Dimitri, the Korea stuff is very interesting, of course, as I thought was the Myanmar item, but we're going to shift stateside and talk about a brewing, constitutional crisis, not just going on with the Trump election and the upcoming Iowa caucus, but as my favorite wheelchair-bound governor, Greg Abbott here in Texas himself, finally, grows a spine. I don't know if that's offensive because he's paralyzed, but, grows a spine and enforces the border and is going to start arresting illegal immigrants and has even prevented federal border patrol from accessing this certain section of the border that is a hotspot for illegal immigration. So taking these borders into Texas's hands. So do you have anything to say on the East or anything else? Or are you ready to go stateside?
Yeah, I think stateside is appropriate. Like what we're seeing right now is a constitutional jurisdictional crisis in the U.S. and Greg Abbott actually taking matters into his own hands, which I completely support. We see the U.S. actually, just recall the falling the disassembly of the Soviet Union. All these various states and former members of the USSR were completely endorsed by America to seek their own independence. But within the U.S. itself, states cannot seek, of course, independent action. It's seen as a crisis, a point of like contention against the whole, against the unitarian rule of Washington D.C. So again, it's this hypocrisy that we see from between American foreign policy and diplomacy from the 90s until now, and even a state like Texas, which is directly impacted by all these at this point hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants coming over the border. And these aren't just families. People need to keep in mind it's not just about, well, but Christ, Joseph, and Mary, they could escape into Egypt during the persecution of Herod. No, this isn't the same. This is not just families coming over the border. And frankly, Egypt and the Levant of Herod were essentially the same state. They simply crossed, essentially without a visa, shall we say, into Egypt because it was all part of the Roman Empire at the time under Augustus. So let's not get it twisted too far. But what we're seeing
What are
here,
these? Are these open borders activists advocating for the
oh
return of the
yeah,
Roman Empire? Like, I think we could get
yeah,
behind that. They wouldn't like some other elements of that, but
absolutely not. And I look, what we're seeing here is mostly young men seeking work. And in fact, maybe this is being promoted by various capitalists in the US and other interests, but whatever the reason, they shouldn't be crossing the border without actual checks, without background checks, children's checks. You can't even get jobs in certain Western countries without checks, without criminal background checks. And we don't know anything about these people. They're not even from Mexico. if they were refugees, this we're talking about international legal standards,
Most
refugees.
of them are from Venezuela and
Well, that's
Ecuador
right.
and Africa.
So,
So
so the arguments are completely insane. It's similar to Afghanistanis who, essentially run. And no offense, I mean, these people from Afghanistan, refugees coming out of there for 2 decades at this point. Ever since until Joe Biden has pulled out the troops, essentially, Afghanistani refugees going to Europe. Refugees, by international law, need to stop in the nearest safest country. The fact that they're going through Iran and places like this and claiming that Iran isn't a safe country is a little bit racist, if anything. Like, Iran is a completely functional state. You can stay there, right, in a refugee camp, or Turkey, or, I mean, Iraq, probably not, but even Azerbaijan, for example. You don't need to go to the country with the best welfare system. That isn't part of being a refugee. So I just want to keep this in mind. If in fact people think we're against immigrations or we're against refugees, no, we understand. Refugees from Russia. Where was the first places they went after the revolution? Manchuria, China, adjacent countries, Serbia, Bulgaria. Read the Lives of Saints. Read Saint John of Shanghai, Saint Theophan, the New Recluse, the early Rocor Church. Where did all of
yeah, I
these
mean,
people?
St.
Yeah,
John of Shanghai was in California by way of
that's
Shanghai.
right.
You know,
They stopped in the nearest countries because they were legitimate. I mean, I'm not saying that these South Americans are not legitimate refugees, but the image of refugees, the ideas that they're
I'm saying
purporting,
that.
very different. Yes, look, potentially, but I'm just giving them a bit of breathing room here. I'm not just suffocating the whole issue. But what we're seeing here
Well,
is
and I
completely
mean, the
illegitimate.
feds
Yeah.
definitely, the feds are doing everything they can to, not to interrupt you, but they're doing everything they can to make sure Texas doesn't stop this from happening. And this is in an overnight DOJ filing. The feds confirmed that the Texas National Guard has deployed armed soldiers and vehicles to block federal government from accessing the river in Eagle Pass, Texas, and informed them that no Border Patrol agents will be allowed to enter Shelby Park in any operational capacity. This from Intel Slava Z. This is a significant escalation by Texas after the feds fought to remove Texas water barriers and razor wire, and the DOJ is suing Texas over its new border security law. This is potentially setting up to be the biggest state versus federal fight in a very long time. And I agree. And of course, it's a popular issue. Of course, it'll only increase Abbott's popularity. And Abbott at this point sees the election looming and is, I think, growing a little bit more of a spine to actually take this on. I mean, he's declared the emergency at the border, I think, well over a year ago at this point. Everyone has been waiting for him to actually confront the feds and confront the Biden regime and see if they're willing to put the boot on the neck over illegal immigration or if they'll back off. Because we want to see, like, everybody is willing to see the Texas state government go this far, and he would definitely not lose political support. He himself is just afraid of the consequences. And sure, it's uncharted territory. It takes a strong man to do it, and Greg Abbott, again, he's literally wheelchair bound. He might not be the man for the job, but he sees Trump on the horizon and knows that if he can keep this fight going, maybe win a few court battles. He's got a brave attorney general in Ken Paxton, who Trump supports and would be an amazing nationwide attorney general if Trump is to become president. He has him, so maybe he sees Trump on the horizon and thinks he can win a lot of political points now that Trump is boosting and Biden may be afraid to go to bat for illegal immigrants so hard during an election year, because that is a very unpopular issue.
Yeah, I think, look, Mr. Abbott, he's definitely a politician through and through, but I think he can see Gandalf, the riders of Rohan and Aomir on the horizon, ready to lift the Uruk-hai siege of Helm's Deep, right? He sees Trump and, like, the Patriots actually in control, maybe in a few months' time. He just needs to hold Texas and actually keep it together. Perhaps the actual border will be built, considering, imagine the argumentation Trump could use when he comes to power. He can say, look, we spent literally 100 plus, north of 100 billion US dollars in Ukraine, and we cannot spend, say, 15, 20 billion on our own border in the South, considering how many criminals, essentially how many cartels are utilizing these particular routes in order to get into the US, and the fentanyl crisis, things like that, which took out the late George Floyd. People like that, it's just, it's a tragedy, right, on the horizon for the American people, domestically speaking, and it needs to be dealt with. It's not about a matter of protectionist foreign policy. It's a matter of actually protecting the American people. We've spoken about this crisis. Even when, remember, the Chinese representatives actually visited San Francisco, one of the issues Joe Biden spoke to them about was the fentanyl crisis and the issue of these Mexican drug houses using Chinese ingredients to make fentanyl, sending it over the border. Again, it's like, this is a real thing even the Joe Biden administration admits. So we just have to keep that in mind. Like, this is a proper crisis in the US. It's more important than whatever's happening in the Middle East, right? As bad as the genocide of the Palestinians is, the US the onus should be on the Islamic countries to prevent Israel from doing so. Israel does not need American protection under any circumstances. I mean, if anything, this is sort of cooperating with the genocidal, I would say, racist state of Israel, because they're genuinely, in their Talmudic religion, they are incredibly racist, seeing everybody else as goyims, cattle, things like that. So this is like genuine racism, and not really like the trope that we see very often in media. But at the moment, yeah, I think it's not racist to say that we don't want mass immigration in the U.S. We don't want hundreds and thousands of refugees coming over the border unchecked, with no safety, no healthcare, no ability to actually integrate and assimilate into American society. And again, the arguments that they're mostly Catholic, things like that, these don't really work, because the really hardworking Christian Catholic South Americans, they remain in South America. They remain in places like Mexico. They work hard and they rebuild their lives. They don't skip countries on their journey towards the one place where they want to be, this El Dorado. This is not how this is not how refugee laws work. We've spoken about international law. This is not what being a refugee means, getting to the best country on the horizon, stopping at the nearest, safest place and seeking refuge.
No, it's the institutionalized great replacement. I mean, it's a whole system. All the routes are mapped out. The NGOs, whether they're Jewish or Catholic, and those are the two biggest perpetrators. You don't really see any Orthodox Christian NGOs facilitating, the great replacement over the border of illegal immigration. But there's an unfortunate amount of Catholic groups and a very large amount of Jewish groups that are involved in this. I mean, you'll see Stars of David on the sides of some of these buses, taking people, whether it's from Panama up to the Mexican border, or, Mexico up to the US border, or some of these places. It's a whole big operation. And it probably, like we said, they say the illegal immigrants dug the Chabad tunnels, and it probably goes even deeper than that. So the connection is there. But I mean, this is, of course, a silver platter issue for Donald Trump in the election as the Iowa caucus approaches. January 15th, Monday, will be when the first votes are cast in the 2024 presidential election. That's right. Iowa will be deciding which Republican they want to give their votes to in this primary. Trump is far and away, he has over 50% support. I think it's even higher than that, maybe even over 70% in Iowa. So he's going to totally sweep it. And then following that is New Hampshire a few days later. And these two states are really where it kind of is realized who never had any support to begin with. And of course, we're going to see Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley really lose a lot of support. And Vivek Ramaswamy has talked about this. Chris Christie was caught on a hot mic talking about this, how in many ways it seems the plan could be DeSantis drops out and throws in support for Haley to try to rally support behind him, because she's been polling higher than he is. She's got the big donor support. The establishment, I think, even wants Haley more than they want Joe Biden second term. So if it wasn't for the huge Trump behemoth, preventing her from ever getting even close to the White House, she could be the person. But as Chris Christie said on the hot mic backstage, he said she's going to get smoked, and that you and I both know she's not up to this. That's what he said. And apparently DeSantis called him petrified about his imminent loss in Iowa, despite the fact that DeSantis visited every single county in Iowa, all 99 counties. Some of those probably have like a few hundred people, and he's probably going to not even come second. Like, maybe he comes second, but like, there's some people even say that Vivek could surprise us and do just as well as DeSantis. So it's very interesting. Of course, we're going to probably see the race totally collapse to just Trump. And of course, smarter characters like Abbott and other people around the country endorse Trump. But a few people have had to rescind their DeSantis endorsements because they really thought that the party had moved on and was ready to go back to Tea Party tier policy wonk nonsense. But no, it's the Trump and Reich or nothing at this point. And sure, after this election cycle, I agree, America is going to be a very different place. And, maybe this is the last election. That's the kind of things people say. But again, the border issue is only going to help boost Trump, and it'll help boost him in the general, very much so, of course, because, and like I said, Abbott might see that and be like, Joe Biden may not want to take the political hits of sending troops in on Texas state troopers that are arresting illegal immigrants, which would be a really bad look. But, Trump may be advising him on this. It's an interesting situation. But yeah, we're watching it closely, and follow us on social media, on Telegram and on Twitter, World War Now _. I'm at Gnome Rad. Follow us on Telegram, World War Now Telly, because we'll be posting about this stuff live as it happens. But I think we have to move on to a brief note on Greece and Turkey. Of course, Turkey is conducting pretty massive strikes on the Kurds in its eastern regions, and even parts of Syria just across Kurdistan, which again is the largest kind of ethnic state that is not really recognized by anybody. So it's Kurdistan is stems from Turkey across Syria into Iraq and even into Iran. The Kurdistan region of Iran is where ISIS-K actually operates when it does come to Iran from Afghanistan, and it's where that whole fake hijab woman that got killed by the morality police protest psyop started. It was a Kurdish woman. That's where a lot of the U.S. color revolution stuff in Iran comes from. But yeah, Turkey was striking the Kurds, and amidst all of this, Greece, has decided that they're drafting laws to legalize gay marriage. We talked about this before, but it seems that that is moving forward. Mitsotakis, despite him being from the quote unquote, more right wing government in Greece, the center right party, of course, he's totally caving on these issues, total slave to the European Union. But I mean, there's going to be some protests, there's some Greeks taking to the streets. But at the end of the day, this is the same thing we talked about with Georgia. Georgia has been much more active in mobilizing against homosexuality, and because of that, they are now probably going to be able to maybe resist entering the European Union from a moral perspective, like prevent their government from ever getting into this place to begin with. But, as Elder Ephraim of Arizona, he said that Greece has turned its back on Christ and is sleeping in its own muck. So again, people like to criticize Greek people like to get mad at anybody that criticizes Greece that isn't Greek. And I love Greece. I want Greece to be the most amazing Orthodox nation it could be. I agree. Constantinople is first among equals. None of us here deny this. But with all the ecumenism and the stuff in Ukraine and now this nonsense, like it's really hard to be a real Byzantine enthusiast like I would like to be. So we're of course praying for Greece. We're hoping that this can be turned around and maybe if there is mass mobilization, they might reconsider.
Yeah, I mean, this is the real struggle of smaller Orthodox countries around the world: Georgia, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece. I mean, look, well, and even Romania. They have to struggle against this push and pull between, I guess, these two poles, right? The multipolar world, so to speak, and then the unipolar hegemonic world, which there a lot of them are directly adjacent to and allies of, right? Like Greece, for example, with Prime Minister Kyriakos. I mean, look, what can I say? This is obviously we're seeing the entree of this proposition that actually, the Prime Minister of Greece came onto the television. He openly said that, look, Greek males won't be able to use surrogate mothers. So he actually openly said that that's not an option. It's like, well, praise the Lord that we haven't reached complete degeneracy. But he's saying, look, same-sex marriage needs to be somehow, institutionalized in Greece in order to protect the rights of these minorities and things like that. Give them a fair go, so to speak. Which, no comments on that, right? But I think it's time for the Church of Greece and the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the Archbishop of Athens, to, uh, you know, actually raise the flag and bring the Orthodox people. You bring all your authority, which you have gathered over the centuries since the Greek Revolution against the Ottoman Empire, bring that and use it. Actually, use what respect you have of the Greek people and actually bring them to the streets. Bring them out against this prime minister and his degenerate policies, which will destroy Greek culture and the Greek, social moral system, which again the EU has been trying to erode for decades at this point. But we do have to keep that in mind. There's the pressures on the Georgian people, Romanians, Bulgarians, and even the strange statements made by the Georgian patriarch, probably fake, but what statements haven't been fake, unfortunately, even pretty weird news. But the patriarch of Bulgaria, actually, Patriarch Neophytos, essentially, is stated outright that he condemned. I mean, he's been in hospital recently, but he came out of hospital, and the first thing he says is he condemns the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and he thinks Russia is criminal. It's like, haven't you forgotten, dear patriarch, exactly, I mean, what special military operation took place in the 1860s and 1870s? Which country did Russia invade in order to free the Bulgarian people? Was it the Ottoman Empire? Was it the Islamic Caliphate by any chance? But that military operation was completely supported by the Bulgarians. But this one, against NATO and the infestation of the Chabad and the Mossad and all these other people holding power in Ukraine, persecuting the church, that isn't legitimate in any capacity. I mean, you're the patriarch of Bulgaria. I just want to have some. He says military action can never be justified. I'm sorry. Have you Bulgarian history? Hello, let's all open a history book for the first time. I don't want to, of course, speak badly about any of these hierarchs. Of course, he came out of hospital. He was unwell. But anyways, for people not briefing him on exactly what's happening in world news, I think that's very offensive. So the people in Bulgaria actually need to lift their game up a little bit, because at the moment, these other Orthodox countries, they are being pulled into the orbit of this unfortunate Western degenerate influence, politically as well as culturally speaking. I think this is the trend we're seeing, including forcing some of these hierarchs even and politicians to make these really bizarre statements. It's very sad.
Well, I think as far as Greece goes, I agree with our friend Paisios. He says this: the political solution for Greece is to elect the victory, the Nika party, which we've talked about them on the show before. They have entered, I think, the Greek parliament with a few seats. They have the most support among clergy and monastics in Greece, including St. Paisios' own family. One of St. Paisios' nieces is an active party official. It's anti-Freemason, anti-abortion, anti-NATO-dox, anti-Zionist, and emphasizes a new pan-Orthodox military and economic alliance with Russia and the Balkan Orthodox nations instead of the EU and NATO. So, if you're in Greece, go to the streets, go to some anti-sodomy protests, wave the flag of Christ's face and vote for the Victory Party. Stop voting for New Democracy. Stop voting for the communists, the socialists. Stop voting for, even like maybe vote for the New Golden Dawn Party, but even don't vote for them. Vote for the Victory Party, the Nika Party. It's obviously the Orthodox Nationalist Party. So take your country back. Stop with this silly, NATO docs, EU nonsense. But yeah, with all of that, again, the Greece-Turkey thing is always lurking in the background. Turkey asserting itself really in all directions still. And we just know that when Erdogan finally goes, or, again, there is always the chance that he gets diplomatically swayed back over into the NATO sphere of influence, just depending on what happens, of course. But he has gotten a boost of support among his people because of the Gaza situation. And because of that, who knows? Maybe he will use Greece's participation in Operation Prosperity Guardian or Greece's support for the Zionist entity to move on some of those islands. Those things are always possible. Like they said, they like to say that we will come in the night and they won't see it coming. And as St. Paisio said, Russia and Turkey will go from friends to enemies overnight like that with like the snap of a finger. So we're always watching that very closely. But with all of that, Dimitri, that's about all the stories I have to cover. Is there anything we've missed?
No, I completely agree. Look, with the Saint Paisios prophecies about about the coming conflict between Turkey and Greece, things in the world have really occurred overnight, especially conflicts even between Russia and Ukraine, for example. 24th of February, nobody really saw it coming. There was some premeditation, but it happened suddenly. A lot of these things, the 24th of June, Prigozhin's march in Moscow, things happen overnight. You literally wake up, watch the news, and there's another conflict somewhere brewing. These American strikes against the Houthis in Yemen. Things happen without any. You don't receive any notifications on your telephone. It's just you check the news, you read your newspaper, you check your Twitter app, things like that. So, I think the prophecies actually speak complete truth in this particular capacity, or even the October 7th operation. Nobody really saw that coming, including the Israelis themselves. So things can change very quickly. And Erdogan is, we've seen him this very shrewd politician, and look, he's preparing his forces by training them, essentially sending them to northern Syria to actually fight against these Kurds. He's keeping them tense. He's actually, if anything, the Turkish military, the Turkish Air Force have had active military training in these battle zones of Syria and Iraq. So you have to keep in mind, where has the Greek military been training recently? And this, despite the fact that Turkey is already twice or almost twice as strong as Greece is in terms of military capacity and naval capacity, things like that. So I think definitely certain big things will take place in the future, and we'll just have to keep following the news and seeing where all of this leads.
And yeah, so I think that's a good place to wrap this up. It was a really packed show. World War III is in full effect. So we're watching the Red Sea. We're watching, again, East Africa is still very much in play with Somaliland. That situation is developing. So we'll probably have an update for that next week. Of course, South America, always now a relevant front. The election, now the U.S. border, of course, Russia, Ukraine, and the Gaza situation. I mean, it is now, when we come back on the show, we could be striking other countries. We could have struck Iran by the time we come back next week. So I'll be watching really closely. And with all of that, worldwarnow.substack.com, worldwarnow.co, that's where you can find everything, read all of our articles, listen to all of the shows. Again, we're here with some back-to-back shows this week, so be sure to check out the previous episode as well as our Easter Hour with Shane Swenson, fantastic American iconographer. It was a really good conversation, so we'll have that linked below. Give it a good listen, subscribe, get behind the paywall. It supports us. It helps us keep these weekly shows free for everybody to share this information, and you get access to some really incredible deeply researched episodes. So get behind the paywall, get access to the Ether Hour. That's on the Substack, worldwarnow.co. Linked below, whether you're here on Substack or on YouTube, you can subscribe right below. So get to doing that. But follow us on YouTube, of course, World War Now. Get our subscriber count up. It really helps us out. Follow us on Telegram, World War Now Telly. That's where we're kind of most actively updating you on the Third World War itself. It's where all the sources and some of these details really come from. I follow hundreds of channels, so I'm surveying the whole situation there. Follow us on Twitter, World War Now _. Follow me on Twitter at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri on Twitter at OCanonist. Follow us on Rumble, World War Now. And yeah, I think that's everything. Dimitri, I'll let you send us off.
Thank you guys for your support. Check out our latest 8-hour episode with Shane Swenson. I think it's excellent. It really, it's a different perspective, actually, speaking to an iconographer, someone so involved in the church, giving all of his support. I think it's definitely a good episode. Thank you for all our supporters this year. And look, we're only going on to 3 weeks now into 2024, and already there's so much news. I mean, every episode is like an hour and a half easily. There's just a lot of stuff to cover, and in fact, I don't think we'll be cutting any corners this year in terms of actually reporting this news to you. There's just too much stuff, and look forward to next week. And hopefully, I pray that things don't really get out of hand, because at this point, it's not even worthy of. I mean, yeah, it's just incredibly concerning. And thank you guys for your support. We will send this one off.
God bless everybody.